Good evening. My name is Marty Schickman, and I'm director of the Center for Jewish Studies at Eastern Michigan University. I want to welcome you to Making Sense of the Jewish Vote in 2020, a conversation with pollster Jim Gerstein. Tonight's presentation is dedicated to the memory of founding board member Tom Easthope. 9 years ago, Jewish Studies at Eastern Michigan was just a wild dream when several faculty members sat down with members of the community to consider the feasibility of such a vision. Tom Easthope was one of those community members who believed we could make the dream a reality. With kindness, intelligence, good humor, and an absolutely unconquerable spirit, he worked to guide our program into existence. Nobody loved an underdog like Tom Easthope, and he helped to turn this one into a winner. Now the Center for Jewish Studies offers classes in Jewish life and culture to EMU students both on campus and on the road, in places as close as, well, home, and as far away as New York City, Berlin, Krakow, Barcelona, and Jerusalem. We sponsor faculty and student research, and we are responsible for this lecture series, which over the years has brought students and community members together to sample latkes for Hanukkah, taste kosher soul food with culinary historian Michael Twitty, dance to klezmer music, laugh at old Jews telling jokes, and just a few weeks ago, sing with Israeli-Palestinian singer-songwriter Mira Awad. Tom Easthope loved our lecture series, bringing his deeply critical mind and indefatigable good cheer to nearly every event. He particularly loved thinking about and talking politics, which is why tonight's presentation really suits him. Even now, I can imagine him joking around, arguing ideas, having a ball. Our speaker this evening, political pollster Jim Gerstein, is America's leading authority on Jewish voting habits. Mr. Gerstein has visited EMU before. He has become something of a regular on our campus, and we always enjoy welcoming him back. He was one of our center's very first speakers, and he has met with our students many times in Washington. He's a dear, enduring friend of EMU Jewish Studies, and like Tom Easthope, a mensch of the very highest order. I would now like to turn things over to EMU professor Jessica Decky-Alexander, who will make the formal introduction. But before I do, if you have questions for Jim Gerstein, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and write them in, and we will ask some of them, as many as we can, at the end of Mr. Gerstein's presentation. Thank you all very much. Decky-Alexander.
Thanks so much, Marty. So I'm also honored to talk a little bit about Tom and Jim in a little bit. So Tom, so everyone needs that person who can lift any burden, break any tension, light up any room, emanate warmth and love across a table or generations, between adversaries or opposing tensions. So picture this. A priest, a rabbi, and Tom Easthope walk into an EMU Jewish Studies reception, accompanied by wine and rhetoric on faith and fear and bystanders in the Holocaust. And there's Tom, pontificating and politicking and performing, holding court, actually, between the faith and culture he was born into and the community he became part of. Tom Easthope, among his many innate skills, was that of convener, collector of differing faiths and cultures, communities and spirits. What a remarkable gift to be able by just your state of being in this world, to bring people even into a moment of togetherness. So I have known Tom for almost my whole life here in Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti, 25 years, half my life. He is the father of my former EMU co-conspirator, collaborator, Mary Jo Desprez. And when Marty wanted to launch, as he said, Jewish Studies, also known as the little program that could, he asked if I knew some community members that we would consider being part of our fledgling advisory group. So I reached out to Donna and Tom, both global in thought and in life, and believed they could be ambassadors and advocates of the little program that could, not knowing that they and he would become part of its identity and its soul. We will so miss the little program that could soul, Tom, as he helped the program become a center of ideas and interests, the Jewish world writ large. And we thank him for making it so. Speaking of someone at the center of Jewish world, or at least its politics, its personalities, its policies and platforms, hobnobbing with everyone from Ehud Barak to Barack Obama. I actually don't know if that's true, but it really worked poetically, and I wanted to have that in, is Jim Gerstein. Beyond his startling wit, his dashing good looks, his captivating character, and his notoriety as my good friend from high school and childhood, he is widely acknowledged as America's leading authority on Jewish voting patterns. He is a founding partner of GBAO, a Washington-based firm providing strategic planning, communications, project management, and research services to nonprofit organizations, advocacy leaders, corporations, labor unions, and political candidates, some even in our own backyard. Previously, Mr. Gerstein, Jim, was executive director of the progressive research and strategy organization, Democracy Corps. And from 1997 to 2001, he was executive director of the Center for Middle East Peace and Economic Cooperation. During the 1999 Israeli prime ministerial campaign, Gerstein joined Ehud Barak's US-based consulting team, led by James Kerbel, slacker, and he served as the team's representative on the ground in Israel, overseeing polling, paid media, and message development for the campaign. It is so my honor to bring back our friend, my friend, Jimmy Gerstein. Take it away, Jimmy.
Hi, well, thank you, Jess, for that awesome introduction. I appreciate it. It was way over the top, but that's what we would expect from you. So thank you. And thank you to Marty and Jeff Bernstein and the Center for Jewish Studies for inviting me tonight. I particularly am honored to be here as you guys are thinking about Tom. And that was those were lovely, really lovely remarks. And it's a privilege to be here when you guys are thinking about him. This is the third presidential election in a row that we have done this event about the Jewish vote, and I have loved visiting the Center for Jewish Studies at Eastern Michigan each time, and I have loved seeing your students in Washington, D.C. I can't wait for you guys for us all to get through the pandemic and to be back in touch in person. And I will gladly take you up on the offer to come back to Ypsilanti to do this in person next time. So, and one last thank you is to everybody who's joining. This is, whole presentation by Zoom. It may not be the single most exciting thing that you have done all year. Hopefully the election night was more exciting. But I'm glad that so many people are interested in this topic, and I'm looking forward to sharing a bunch of data with you to talk about the Jewish vote and how what was driving it in the 2020 election. In 2020 for Democrats, obviously it was a great win, and I would thank you to all the voters in Michigan who helped put Joe Biden over the top as a Democratic pollster. This was a special win for us. I was also involved, as Jessica alluded to, we were involved with the efforts to support Gary Peters and some of the outside groups that were supporting him in Michigan. So that was, as everybody knows, a very close election, and every little thing matters in an election, in a close election, including the Jewish vote. As small as it may be, every little thing matters in a close election. So as it relates to the Jewish vote, 2020 resembled a lot of past elections. What I mean by that is, of course, there was the quadrennial talk of this is the year that the Republicans are going to make inroads with the Jewish vote. We see it every 4 years. This time they even gave it a name. Donald Trump and friends of his called it the Jexodus. And it, as we've seen every 4 years, this prophecy, it falls apart on election night, and Jewish voters turn out to be one of the strongest base voting groups for the Democratic Party and the Democratic candidate for president in particular. This year was actually a little bit different in the sense that the vote shifted beyond its usual average of 70% for the Democratic candidate to 79%. That shift is notable because it's very hard to increase your vote beyond 70%. No matter what the constituency is, there's maybe 1 or 2 constituencies in the entire country that vote more than that amount for their party. In any case, Trump was a uniquely bad president in the eyes of Jewish voters, and that is and I'll show you the data in a minute, but that speaks to why the vote even moved further than it had been in the past. So the data I'm going to show you now is from an election night poll that we conducted of Jews who voted in the election. The results include people who voted on election day and people who voted early. It is a representative sample of the Jewish population, and this is it's a unique data set. So I'm very much looking forward to sharing it with you. Let me pull up my screen share, and we'll walk through it, and I will refer to these slides, but we'll also do the Q&A at the end. But for starters, just so you know what we did here, this was a survey of 800 Jewish voters. These are people who voted in the election, and it was conducted, you can see it started on October 28th, so we could capture some of the early voting, and it went through November 3rd, of which was election night. And we turned this around and presented it the morning after, because there's this constant race to know what happened in the election. The margin of error on this was plus or minus 3.5 percentage points. And as we start to look at the data, I want to start with what the Jewish electorate looks like. For one, it's really important to understand when trying to understand the Jewish vote, that it's a very liberal, very progressive constituency. You can see here that 30% of Jews who voted describe themselves as liberals. Another 22% describe themselves as progressive. So that's a total of 52% who say liberal or progressive. Only 17% describe themselves as conservative. And to clarify, that's conservative on the ideological scale, not on the Reform, conservative, Orthodox scale. So a majority are liberal or progressive, and a large majority describe themselves as Democrats. 60% when asked which party do you identify with, 60% say they identify with the Democratic Party. Only 14% say they identify with the Republican Party. And you can see another 26% say that they consider themselves independents. When you ask the independents which party they lean toward, they break overwhelmingly towards the Democrats. But this gives you a sense of what the base numbers are for each party among the Jewish vote. And when we're looking at the context in which this election took place, I know there's a lot of numbers and lines on this graph. But what this asks is whether people think that we are going in the right direction or whether the country's off on the wrong track. And what you can see here, if you look at the right side of this graph, this red line represents the percentage of Jews who said that the country was off on the wrong track. By election day in 2020, 85% of Jews said that the country was off on the wrong track. That is an ornery bunch. That is people who are demanding change. And you can see over time, this got much worse in terms of the direction that the country was headed when Donald Trump became president. This 55% wrong track is from November 2016. By November 2018, in the midterm elections, that had skyrocketed to 74%. It continued throughout the rest of his presidency, all the way up to 85% wrong track. So this is a liberal, progressive constituency seeking change. When we ask people what issues were driving their vote, you start to see some of the nuance within the Jewish constituency. These are the top 2 issues that people said were most important in deciding their vote in the presidential election. And here, when you look at this column, this is the total sample. The number 1 issue, not surprisingly, was the coronavirus pandemic, 54%. You can see a second tier of issues between climate change, healthcare, and the economy. That's that second tier. But when you look at it by denomination, you start to see what's kind of the dynamics that are right below the surface. The Reform, Conservative, and those who say they don't have any denomination, these voters all are, fairly similar in terms of their top issue. For all of them, the top issue is the pandemic. And then they had that same level, that same grouping of second tier issues with climate change, healthcare, and the economy. But the Orthodox population, which is 10% of the Jewish population, the Orthodox population was not focused on the coronavirus pandemic. There's many things that could be discussed around that finding, but but what I take away from this is how different their priorities were from the rest of the population, but they are, like I said, they're a minority of the population, 10%. Their top issue was the economy, and their second most important issue was Israel. 27% said Israel was the most important issue for them when deciding how to vote. You can see among the Reform, Conservative, and those with no denomination, Israel is a lower tier issue. I would point out that Israel is, while it's lower on their list of priorities, we have other data that shows that Jews do care a lot about Israel. It's important to them, but that a candidate simply needs to pass a threshold of being sufficiently supportive of Israel before the voter will move on to the other issues that are their bigger priorities, the things that are affecting them in a day-to-day basis, such as the pandemic, healthcare, and the economy. So I point out that Israel is at the bottom of the list. It doesn't mean people don't care about it. It just means that once this candidate passes that threshold of credibility on Israel, they move on to other issues. It's also a very easy threshold to pass, which I'll show later. When we get past the political findings, I'll show a little bit about findings about Israel. Another dynamic that's driving the vote is how the voters feel about the candidates themselves and the parties. And what you see here is a bunch of data about which asks whether people are favorable or unfavorable towards certain candidates or certain individuals. And what we can see here is the green bars represent the percentage of people who say that they have a favorable opinion of this person or entity. And Barack Obama, Joe Biden, the Democratic Party all have very strong high favorabilities, fairly stable or similar levels of unfavorable, 23 to 31%. That's the kind of the center left part of the equation. When you go to the other side, we'll come back to Netanyahu in a minute. But when you look at the other side, you see Trump, the Republican Party, and Mitch McConnell all have very low favorable ratings and astonishingly high unfavorables, 77% unfavorable towards Trump, 79% unfavorable towards the Republican Party, 78% unfavorable towards McConnell. I emphasize this because for all this talk that this is the year that Jews are going to vote Republican, it's extremely difficult and extremely unlikely for that to happen as long as this Republican Party favorability rating is 20 favorable, 79 unfavorable. That is, there is a hostility among Jewish voters towards the Republican Party that make it virtually impossible for them to make serious inroads until they take the steps that would change their image. And there's really no evidence right now that the direction that the Republican Party is going is an image-making process that is going to endear themselves to Jewish voters. So that is a core finding here in the survey. I also point out Netanyahu. This 31 favorable, 61 unfavorable is, to me, one of the most striking findings in the survey. The office of the Prime Minister in Israel is a very highly regarded, respected position. Jews almost always have a favorable view of the Prime Minister of Israel, But what we've seen, and I'm going to show you here a time series of this on the right side here. What we've seen is that Netanyahu's embrace of Donald Trump has cost him dearly in terms of his support among Jews in America. So I know there's a lot of numbers on this line, and I will try to make it as clear as possible by stating, let's just look at where Netanyahu was in 2014. In 2014, he had a 53 favorable, 24 unfavorable among Jewish voters. You start to see that decline. And what happened in real time, in real events, when we started to see this decline, was that Barack Obama was president, and he was working to pass the Iran agreement. And Benjamin Netanyahu, who opposed the agreement, came to Washington, D.C., approached the Republican Congress to seek the opportunity to speak on the floor of the Congress against Obama's Iran agreement. It turns out that American Jews did not like that very much, as he was attacking, using a Republican Congress at the time as a venue to attack the Democratic president of the United States. So you see that by 2016, Netanyahu's favorability dropped from this 53-24 all the way down to 41-28. 2016, we have the election. Donald Trump becomes president. First 2 years of Trump's presidency, in which Netanyahu is embracing Trump, you see that his favorability continues to drop, and it's about even. And the final 2 years, it just accelerated to a 61 unfavorable, 31 favorable. So I think this speaks. This is a statement about Trump as much as it is about Netanyahu. I expect that over time, Netanyahu will rehabilitate himself with Jewish voters in the United States, but that remains to be seen. And as for those who are following it, there is an election in Israel today. The results or the exit polls have come out, and they're still counting votes, but it looks like another election that is neck and neck there. We can talk about that later if folks have questions. Finally, I don't want to belabor the point too much, but the Republican favorability has also gotten worse under Trump. It is now at an all-time bad. 79% of Jews in America or Jewish voters in America have an unfavorable view of the Republican Party. You can see this has gone up since Trump took office. So he has he has damaged the Republican Party with Jewish voters in a pretty severe manner. We will see if and when the party can recover from that. Quickly, and I just showing here the time series on Trump's favorability. It started out badly in 2016, and it continued to remain bad, his unfavorable rising to 77%. It's not just that they don't like Trump. They think he did a bad job. Here's his job approval. 23% approve of the job that Donald Trump did as president, compared to 77% disapprove. The only constituency in the Jewish population that thought Trump did a good job were the Orthodox population. 83% job approval among the Orthodox population, compared to 17, 30, and 9% among no denomination, conservative, and reform. So this is there's a lot of data points in here that just show the different worldviews held among reform, conservative, and no denomination on the one hand, and the Orthodox population on the other hand. It's not just that they hated Donald Trump and the Republican Party. They also did like Joe Biden. 72% favorable, 25% unfavorable. Again, same dynamic in terms of when you look at different demographics within the Jewish population. Reform, conservative, and no denomination have very high favorables, and the Orthodox population, only 19% give Joe Biden a favorable rating. How does this translate into the vote? So those are all the dynamics behind the vote, right? It's a liberal constituency. It is a liberal constituency that is hostile to Donald Trump and the Republican Party. The issue priorities line up with the issue priorities of most Americans, but from a liberal point of view. How does all that translate into the Jewish vote? What we see here is that, I'm sorry, I said earlier 79%. It's 77% of Jews who voted for Joe Biden, 21% for Donald Trump. you can see compared to 2016, it was that this is an improvement for the Democratic candidate. Hillary Clinton received 170 to 25. So it is hard, as I've mentioned before, the average vote for the Jewish candidate, for the Democratic candidate, going back to when exit polling started in 1972, the average vote has been 70%. It is very hard to exceed that. And it went all the way up to 77% for Joe Biden in this atmosphere with Donald Trump on the ballot. The Biden victory was consistent, or it was broad. He had big margins among men, among women, among young people, among older people, among college graduates, and among non-college graduates. Some of these gaps that you see with education or with gender, we see those gaps as well in the general population. The big difference is that with the Jewish population, even the lower end of it is very high. For example, 70% of Jewish men voted for Joe Biden. Similar dynamic when you look at it by denomination in party identification. Reform, 90% of Reform Jews voted for Joe Biden, 82% of Jews with no denomination, and 70% of conservatives. Contrast that with only 70% of the Orthodox population voted for Biden compared to 79% who voted for Trump. Not surprisingly, Democrats overwhelmingly voted for Biden. Republicans overwhelmingly voted for Trump. The independents who are Jewish voted in large numbers for Joe Biden, 67 to 25. The congressional vote, this is, so in addition to asking who they voted for president, we asked who did you vote for Congress? Was it the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate? What we see here is also part of this trend that I've been emphasizing throughout about what's happened to the Republican Party under Donald Trump. In 2016, the Democratic candidate received 70% of the Jewish vote. That rose to 76 in the midterms in 2018, and bumped up to 78% in 2020. So this is a positive trend for Democrats. Whether they can sustain it in the post-Trump era, hoping we have a post-Trump era here, we will see if that sustains itself or if it will revert back to more historical averages. So that's the political dynamics, and that's how the vote played out. I would like to also talk a little bit about Israel, because there's so much discussion in the public debate about how Jews feel about Israel, the role that Israel plays in their vote, the role that it plays in congressional debate. So we had a large section in our survey about Israel, and here are the core findings. The first thing I would say is that is completely compatible for people. I say Jews believe it is perfectly compatible for someone to be both pro-Israel and critical of Israeli government policy. Those two positions can sit together very comfortably for American Jews. In November of 2018, 84% said yes, somebody can be both pro-Israel and critical of Israeli government policies. In 2020, that rose to 92%. It's a modest increase. It may speak to just the whole dynamic that I was talking about before with Trump and Netanyahu, but in the kind of criticism of anybody who was critical of Israeli government policy, it rose. 92% of American Jews who voted in the election said that it is you can be both critical of Israeli government policies and still be pro-Israel. Unlike the other questions on the political measures that I asked, you can see here even the Orthodox population says, yeah, of course you can be pro-Israel and critical of Israeli government policies at the same time. So you can see that this is a widespread belief, and this is kind of a starting point when looking at American Jewish sentiment about Israel and public debate. When you go further, when we ask people, well, what do you think? How do you think the U.S. should act when it comes to Israeli negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians? Do you think the U.S. should act as a fair and even-handed broker, or do you think the U.S. should side with Israel? Well, by a 71 to 29 margin, American Jews say that the U.S. should be a fair and even-handed broker. It's not that they, that they do care, as I mentioned before, they care about Israel. They want to support Israel. They do support Israel, but they believe the American role in in negotiations is to help achieve an agreement and be a fair and even-handed broker in order to do that. We ask people, actually, I'm going to skip. Well, I'm just trying to manage time here a little bit. Okay. We do ask people kind of an easy question as part of a multi-part exercise. Basically, we say, do you support or oppose the U.S. playing an active role to help the parties resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? 91% of Jews say, I support that. Now, that's an easy thing to agree to. I'm not saying that that's this is the reason we ask it in this easy kind of softball manner is because we are then going to take it to a harder stage. In that harder stage, we ask people, well, would you support or oppose the U.S. playing an active role in helping the parties resolve the conflict, even if it means stating disagreements with both the Israelis and the Palestinians? So when you say publicly stating disagreements with both the Israelis and the Palestinians, 80% support that. They support the U.S. Playing an active role, even if it means publicly stating its disagreements. When we single it out, Israel, so half the sample got the question here on the left side of the graph, and on the right side of the slide, that's half of the sample did not get asked whether they support the U.S. publicly stating its disagreements with both sides. They're asked whether they support the U.S. publicly stating its disagreements with Israel. And when Israel is singled out, you can see the support drops. It goes down to 70%, and 30% say that they oppose that. The lesson here, and we see this on other questions and other data we've asked, other questions they asked over the years and other data, and that is American Jews want the U.S. to be an active, play an active role. They want the United States to help the parties reach a peace agreement. They get they step back a little bit when they feel that Israel's being singled out. So from a matter of communications, from a matter of how the U.S. should be approaching these things, it's very important that they're holding both sides accountable and not singling out one side over the other. We go, when asking about the policy of a final status peace agreement, we do see a lot of support for a two-state solution. We ask people, we inform them that on a few occasions over the past several years, Israeli, Palestinian, and American negotiators came close to reaching a final status agreement, but they ultimately fell short. Here are the details of that agreement. And these have some tough things for supporters of Israel to accept, or at least some things that in the past had been traditionally taboo. First was one of the elements was a demilitarized Palestinian state, borders based on the 1967 borders in which land would be swapped between settlements in the West Bank. They would come back inside of Israel while or they could keep that land in exchange for Palestinians getting comparable land inside the Green Line in return. Another element was that Palestinian neighborhoods in Jerusalem would become part of the new Palestinian state, while Israel retains control of Jewish neighborhoods and the Western Wall in Jerusalem. There's you can see here, there is a clause on refugees that allows refugees to return to Israel. With all of those details, people are asked, do you support or oppose such an agreement? 75% say that they support that agreement, 25% oppose. So by a 3-to-1 margin, very strong support for such a final status agreement. You can see over time, we've been asking this question going back to 2008. And you can see, with the exception of one survey, we've seen very steady support of about 70 to 78% support for that two-state agreement, as detailed on that previous slide. This one's this slide's a little messy, and I'll try to explain it, but I'm going to make the effort because I think it's really important. For the folks who are really deeply entrenched in the Israeli discussion, they would know that there is a debate over whether or not the two-state solution is dead and whether or not there should be a one-state option. It doesn't make a lot of sense to a lot of people. You can see the different descriptions here at the bottom, but the important thing that stands out here is that 72% of Jewish voters, they believe that the best resolution of the conflict is to establish two states with their own separate governments, a Jewish state of Israel living alongside an Arab state of Palestine. 72% of Jewish voters believe that and support that. Only 15% support annexation of the West Bank and making it one state, where that is the homeland of the Jewish people and allows Palestinians to vote for municipal leaders, but not the national government. So that's a 15% who support annexation, and 13% support a one-state solution that is neither Jewish nor Palestinian. It's just one state, everybody has an equal vote, a single government that with representation for both Israelis and Palestinians. So you can see here that the two-state solution, as difficult as it may appear right now, is still the most preferred solution by far among Jewish voters. Finally, a couple other questions that I think may interest you as we look ahead. The first one is about the Iran agreement. We inform people that, as you may know, President Trump withdrew the US from the nuclear agreement that the US made with Iran and 5 other countries. We described the agreement, and we asked, do you support or oppose the US re-entering this agreement? 74% support the US re-entering the agreement. This has been in the news a little bit already during the Biden administration. From a political standpoint, that the Biden administration would have confidence that there is strong Jewish support for their efforts to try and re-enter the agreement. Finally, you can see here that this same dynamic that we've seen throughout the survey, strong support for the Iran agreement among Reform Jews, conservative Jews, and those Jews without any denomination, but strong opposition among Orthodox Jews. Finally, we are on a college campus. It's worth noting the question about that we asked about BDS, boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. 60% of Jewish voters have heard a great deal or something about BDS. It's not massive awareness, but it shows some familiarity. And this has risen over the years, but it is not the dominant issue that that folks may believe if they're only on college campuses. But it's out there. It's not a major issue, but it's out there. You can see awareness is higher among those who are under the age of 40 or 40 to 64 than it is among those who are 65 years and older. Not surprisingly, awareness is highest among the Orthodox population, where this is this gets a lot more attention. And we ask people how they feel about boycotts of Israel. And for people personally, they say that they oppose, 89% oppose a campaign that calls on people to boycott products that are made in Israel. 84% oppose a policy of boycotting products that are made in Israel because of its policies in the West Bank. What this says to me is that all the data that showed people are comfortable with criticism of Israel. They are comfortable with the US playing an active role to help both sides reach an agreement, even if it means publicly stating disagreements. They do have a resistance when they feel Israel is being singled out, and they have resistance in anything that sounds like a boycott or punishment for the state of Israel. So that is the presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see everybody. And I'm eager to see the questions that you may have.
Yes, thank you. That was wonderful. Even when we just prepped through a couple days ago, all of that information and the specifics of it is fascinating. So one of the first questions I want to start with is kind of 2 in 1. For your guys' data, what do you consider the difference between, say, progressive, liberal, or leftist? And then on top of that, do more liberal or progressive candidates have trouble among Jewish voters? How do they fit in? Like, let's say an AOC type, someone who is clearly pushing the bounds of the Democratic Party.
It's a great question, and it's something that is definitely going to be an ongoing issue for the Democratic Party moving forward, whether it pertains to the Jewish voters or Democratic voters more broadly. First of all, when we are dealing with a Democratic constituency, we ask the ideology question differently than we ask it with the general population. We add the term progressive, so it's not just liberal, moderate, and conservative, but it also gives people the option of progressive. And what we find is that there are differences between liberals and progressives, and when it comes, they're not, depending on the issue, it varies. But as it relates to the Jewish population, you can see how there would be more support for somebody like AOC among those who say that they are progressive than among those who said that they are liberal. The progressives will be a little bit more willing to be critical of Israel than liberals. I think there's a bit of a generation and education gap going on there. So there are differences. As regards to the broader question, I think that the Democratic Party just had this debate in the primary, and you could say that Joe Biden kind of represented the liberal wing, or the liberal moderate wing of the Democratic Party, and Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren were more of the progressive wing. And there was a whole debate about this, whether it was about Medicare for all, or open borders versus closed borders, or just the image itself. And as of now, the Democratic Party ended up, resoundingly choosing Biden. I would say that I would point out also that there's a lot of evidence that the Jews in the Democratic Party overwhelmingly supported Biden in the primary as well. So that kind of gives you a flavor of where this is at. But I think there's a lot more study to be had on this division between progressives or the distinction, it's more than division, the distinction between progressives and liberals.
Thank you. That's fantastic. So moving on to our next question. If you could give a little more detail, you highlighted this multiple times and the data supported it consistently, but why specifically are the Orthodox so enthusiastic about Trump and the Republican Party? If you could go into societal or cultural or even the religious details of why that would be the case.
Right. So the survey doesn't specifically get at that, but I can speculate a little bit based on other data and different dynamics that we've seen. For starters, they identify as Republican, and that has become a cultural, political affiliation and identification has a cultural aspect to it. I mean, their Jews are culturally democratic by and large. There's a history there. There's an immigrant history. There is a shared values over time that Jews have had with the Democratic Party. The Orthodox are different. They are more, Israel is a higher priority issue, and they perceive the Republicans as more hawkish on Israel, and they themselves are more hawkish on Israel. So I think that's part of it. There's just also the kind of cultural conservatism of Orthodox Jews that is in contrast to the cultural liberalism of Reform Jews and Jews without, and conservative Jews and Jews without any denomination, whether it's issues such as gay marriage or even I would speculate, gay marriage I know about, I would speculate about things like maybe like climate change, and we saw it with the reactions on COVID and quarantining and mask wearing and things like that. So again, I'm speculating a little bit, but also some of this is born out of certain pieces of the data.
So you highlighted at the beginning of your presentation that the Jewish vote is not a very large portion of the overall American vote. How significant is the Jewish vote in influencing elections? Could you give a little more detail about that?
Sure. So Jews comprise about 3% of the American electorate, and it's concentrated in some states more than others. I believe in Florida, it has ranged to be about 4 or 5% of the electorate in some years, less in other years. Well, in a state where like Florida, where it's decided, where the election sometimes is decided by 537 votes for to pick an example from 2000, every little thing matters. Now, if I were a campaign manager in the state of Florida, I would be first looking at, and I'm trying to move votes that are going to make a difference in the election, I'd be looking at turnout among African Americans. I'd be looking at Hispanic voters. Jews would be on that list, but much more towards the bottom, because we know Jews in Florida are pretty entrenched in their positions. There's a good solid block of 70% or so who vote Democratic, and 30% or so who vote Republican. And that just doesn't move over time, despite some misinformed conventional wisdom. If you're going to try and move 1% of the vote, and Jews are 4% of the population, you're going to need to move 25% of Jews. That's just really, really hard to do. So it's not to say that in a very close election, every little thing that happens is important, but it is the Jewish vote is really so small that it doesn't that it's not the first place that I would start from if my campaign resources were limited.
You might not have data on this question, but it seemed interesting, and just in case you do, how did American Jews feel about the move of the embassy?
We didn't ask data on that, so I don't have that.
Wasn't sure, but I figured it was worth an ask.
Sure.
Moving things back a bit closer to home, any information on why the Gary Peters election was so close?
Sure. Michigan is an evenly divided state. It is, as we know from 2016, it was extremely close, and in 2020 it was closer again. It definitely was closer than we would have hoped or expected a little bit. Michigan is just a very evenly divided state. John James was a good candidate for the Republicans. But in the end, I think his embrace of Trump, particularly when he ran in 2018 against Senator Stabenow, when he really embraced Trumpism, went very hard after Obamacare. I'm sure for those who watch TV live instead of on their DVR and skipping all the commercials, they would have seen a couple of commercials of John James calling Obamacare a monstrosity, and that did not play very well with Michigan voters. And his embrace of Trump sent a signal that he wasn't going to be the kind of independent senator that Michigan voters are seeking. And that made that was a decisive difference. But we haven't seen a landslide election in Michigan in a long time. So it is you guys are at the center of it all, and really are critical in the difference that between a Democratic president and Republican president, and in this case, a Democratic Senate versus a Republican Senate.
Thank you. This is a much more general question. So our question asker cites Mitt Romney, but I'm going to open it up to other, say, more moderate Republicans. Do you think they could be instrumental in changing or impacting Jewish support for the Republican Party? You stressed how much Trump was disliked. Do you think if the Republican Party starts leading on more moderate Republicans, do you think we could see an increase in Jewish support?
It's a fascinating question. I think it's a challenge because it assumes that the Republican Party is ready to embrace their moderate, the Republican voters in the party are ready to embrace the moderates in their party. And moderate is a relative term, okay? They have not shown any indication of that, whether it's the vote to certify the election, the attacks on Liz Cheney, who's not some rebel-rousing liberal, or Justin Meyer for that matter. These are not, these are not left-wing radicals. These are very conservative Republicans, and if they dare cross the supreme leader, they get punished. And so I'm not sure that the party is ready to embrace Mitt Romney or George W. Bush or anybody who could be characterized as not supportive of Trump right now. So now, if they did go there, it's still doubtful in my mind that would attract Jewish voters. I think it would help their party in the long run with the broader electorate, but Jewish voters remain a base Democratic constituency. And we saw when Mitt Romney was on the ticket against Barack Obama, Obama handily defeated him among Jewish voters. I believe that was a 70 or 72% vote for Obama. I don't remember it off the top of my head, but in 2012, it was an easy victory for the Democratic president against someone who today is seen as a Republican moderate.
Bringing it back a little bit more local, specifically Midwest this time. Michigan is really, as you stated, a purple state more than anything. Ohio seems to be moving further red. Illinois is blue. Midwest demographics are all fairly similar. How do you explain the kind of large variation in these three states that are all pretty similar?
Sure. I think that suburbia map is making a big difference. And if you look at the size of the suburban populations in these states, suburban populations have moved much more towards the Democrats, especially under Donald Trump. But Illinois had already been blue prior to Trump. But what you saw in Illinois was what we and Jessica Alexander and myself grew up in the collar counties of Illinois, Lake County, Illinois being one of them. Yeah, I see Jess really representing well there. Those counties, especially like in Illinois, for those who are really familiar with it, DuPage County used to be strong Republican territory. Well, that's changed now, and so in Illinois, so the difference between these three states, a large part of it is kind of the size of the suburban population that bolsters the support of the urban population. And Chicago is such a large piece of Illinois, so that is one thing that distinguishes Illinois from Michigan, which is distinguished from Ohio. I hear there's a rivalry between the two states of sorts, but what you have is I think Ohio has less of that suburban population and changes in suburbs the way we've seen in Michigan. It's always been, Ohio's always been just a little bit further to the right than Michigan. Always maybe overstating it a bit, but traditionally has been a little bit further to the right than Michigan. And Michigan also has a very rich labor history that makes the difference with some of the the white non-college educated population is going to be a little it's moved to be very Republican, but maybe less so in Michigan because of the strong union movement and labor movement in the state.
Do you think this interim election is going to be different? Should Democrats expect to lose Congress, or does COVID change anything there, make it more of a crisis type election again? If Joe Biden, oversees the reopening, we can expect, a boom, probably economically, socially. Could that change things?
I mean, this is, as a Democratic pollster, this is going to be what consumes my work for the next a lot of my work for the next 2 years. And the structural challenge facing Democrats is twofold. One is there's going to be redistricting, and this redistricting will be a net favorable advantage to the Republicans. They're They have more control over the map making across the country, especially in states where there are districts being added or subtracted to the population based on population changes in the 2020 census. So the first challenge facing Democrats is going to be the redistricting that will benefit Republicans. And Democrats don't have a lot of wiggle room here. I believe it's a total of 8 seats differences. So flipping 4. The second thing working against Democrats is in midterm elections, the party that does not hold the presidency traditionally does better. And I believe in the last 150 years, the party in power has gained seats 4 times. Okay, so we have history working against us. Now, one of those 4 times in the past 150 years was 2002. And what was special about 2002? It was in the aftermath of 9/11, and George W. Bush was very strong and very popular in the aftermath of 9/11, which happened a year and change before the 2002 election. And so the question is, are we in a similarly historic period? Because we're coming out of the pandemic, hopefully, because we are going from a horrible economic situation to what appears to be large growth. I believe there have been estimates between 6 to 8% GDP growth this year. Estimate. I don't know the impact that will have on election, because I've never lived through 8% growth in GDP in a year. I very much look forward to it for the sake of our country and for the sake of all the people who've been out of work and struggling and had their incomes cut. So if we come out of the pandemic strong and the economy rebounds the way a lot of economists are indicating, and the Democrats and Joe Biden have just passed the American Rescue Plan and are highly identified in it, in which it got 0 Republican votes, I think that has the possibility of pushing against the tide of history and the redistricting. But it remains to be seen. Look, we'll see how the redistricting takes place in Michigan. We have 2 outstanding members of Congress in very difficult seats in Michigan. I'm talking about Alyssa Slotkin and Haley Stevens. I mean, they really are going to be on the front line of holding Democratic Congress. But if these dynamics play out the way that we're talking, and they both are, we've seen how good they are at knowing their constituencies and knowing their districts and fighting for their districts, that we can, there is reason to be hopeful. But it will be very, very difficult.
Moving to something very topical. Do you have any information, comments on today's vote in Israel?
So right before we got on this Zoom, I was closely watching. I was watching Israeli TV, the joys of the internet, and the exit polls. 2 of the exit polls in Israel showed that Netanyahu had a 61 seat, not the Likud party, but his bloc, the bloc that would vote for him to make him prime minister in a coalition. 2 of the 3 exit polls gave him 61 seats, which was the bare minimum that he would need. One of the exit polls had it deadlocked at 60 to 60. There's a lot of votes to be counted. It feels a lot like the past 3 elections in Israel, where it's just really, really close, and they're going to have to wait until they count every single vote. And then they will have the joy of Israeli politicians debating amongst themselves and negotiating to form a coalition, which having witnessed that up close many years ago, and living at home with an Israeli wife, of which I lose every negotiation every single day, in which our son has inherited her genes and her negotiating skills. I think it could be we'll see how long it takes before we see the ultimate outcome of this election, and whether it leads to another election, which would be no longer unprecedented.
So I think I'll leave us with this one last question, but it's a little bit of a bigger one.
Mhm.
So Trump has clearly done something to the Republican Party. People will argue whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. He's changed it dramatically. He's out of office and largely has been silent, but has shown signs that he doesn't want to be and that he wants to continue this hold. Do you think that is permanently going to alter who votes for Republicans in the future? I mean, let's say 4 more years down the road, 10 years, 20 years. Do you think he'll always have some kind of hold, or do you think it's going to go away?
I think for the near term, he has shown every indication that he is not planning to leave the public space. We've got the leader of the House Republicans flying down to Mar-a-Lago to kiss the ring and get his blessing. We see candidates in primaries trying to get Trump's backing. I believe it was just yesterday that we have somebody who wants to challenge. There's a Republican who wants to challenge the Republican Secretary of State in Georgia because he had the gall to certify the elections that were conducted, and court after court said they were conducted properly. And so Trump now wants to back somebody who will challenge that Republican Secretary of State in a primary. It is very unusual for a former president to get involved in a primary for an office such as the Secretary of State. Can you imagine Barack Obama or George W. Bush doing that? I mean, obviously everything with Trump is inconceivable and it's new and it's silly and unprecedented. But I'm mentioning this in the context of the question of is he still going to be a force in the party? As of now, he continues to be a force. I don't think that, though. I think that there were several Republican senators who believed he committed impeachable offenses, and yet they did not vote to convict him because of their concern about his hold over the party and what it would mean for the party, whether it would affect them individually or it would affect their colleagues as they try to win back the Senate. There's no evidence that Republicans in office right now believe that Donald Trump has gone quietly into the night. Now, what does that mean for 2022? We don't know. When Trump was not on the ballot physically in 2018, Democrats had a huge turnout because of his presence in the presidency, yet Republicans didn't have a similar turnout surge. In 2016 and in 2020, when he was physically on the ballot, both Democrats and Republicans had turnout surges. So we'll see what it's like where he is not, where he's removed from office. He's still in the public eye to a certain extent. How that will impact turnout in 2022, if that will depress Republican turnout or if it will depress Democratic turnout, we don't know yet. 2024, I think he puts a kind of a freeze on the Republican field until he decides what he wants to do. And my guess is he will relish everybody kind of squirming around and trying to figure out what they, whether or not they're running for president, whether they're raising money to run and all that. My guess is he is not taking into account their predicament as he takes his time to make this decision. We will see. But I am hopeful. I expect that history will not be kind to Donald Trump. The present hasn't been kind to Donald Trump, but I don't think history will either. And, I'm hoping that in the Democratic convention in 2072, that he is still a feature of that we're still talking about him as and trying to define the Republican, the Republican Party's image. I don't think it will I don't think he's been good for their party. I don't think it will wear well in the near future, or certainly not in over the long term.
Well, I thank you so much. This has been utterly fascinating to see all of this data and hearing your wonderful answers to the questions. And I'm sure Marty is going to say the same as I pass it over to him.
Jim, I can't even begin to thank you enough. That was amazing. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. And I'd like you all to please mark your calendars for Tuesday, April 20th at 7:00 p.m. when the Center for Jewish Studies will sponsor a conversation with the winningest basketball coach in EMU history, Coach Ben Braun, who is Jewish. I'm so excited, I'm nearly speechless. I'm really looking forward to chatting with Coach Braun. For tonight's presentation, I really want to express my deepest appreciation for my man, Jim Gerstein, who, as always, was brilliant and enlightening. Tonight's lecture would not have been possible without the assistance of Jessica Decky-Alexander, Bruce Katinsky, the Jewish Federation of Greater Ann Arbor, the Jewish Community Foundation of Greater Ann Arbor, the Harold Grinspoon Foundation's Life and Legacy campaign. Those of you who know about it, please do think about participating, and please certainly think about participating in terms of Eastern Michigan University Center for Jewish Studies. And of course, last but never least, the fabulous students of Hillel at Eastern Michigan University. And finally, Tom Easthope, we're going to miss you terribly. May your memory be a blessing. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Again, thank you so much for coming. Jim, you're such a mensch. Thank you for being with us. Cole, you're the man. Decky, I love you. Bye-bye all. Thank you.